to this week's episode of What If Mania. The panel of AJ, Baldy, and myself are ready to tackle on our first of many ultimate what if scenarios. What if the Ultimate Warrior was not fired from the WWE in the early 1990s? But first, today's check-in question. What was your favorite feud of the Warrior? I'll start. For me, it's an easy answer. The easy answer would be the Ultimate Challenge, or even the start of an epic feud with the Ravishing One. But I'm going to go with a feud that I know the Warrior did not like. And the feud that culminated from his heroic return at WrestleMania 8, where he saved Baldy's favorite wrestler, Hogan, from a beatdown at the hands of Sid Justice, and what came to be my favorite feud, Papa Shango. Baldy, I'll give it to you next.
For me, I won't go with the obvious one. For me, the one that stands out is probably the feud with Rick Rude, just because, that was where some of the early on where Warrior had some of his best in-ring matches and just the build-ups. And, Rick Rude is someone, who's a great in-ring worker, was a great promo and the entire build-up. And their two matches at WrestleMania 5 and the Steel Cage match at SummerSlam 90 stand out as two of Warrior's best matches. So for me, it has to be the feud with Rick Rude.
That's a good one. I think Rick Rude is pretty underrated for his in-ring work. For me, I would have to go with the most obvious answer, but I think it needs to be said: Warrior versus Hogan. Their WrestleMania match is probably one of the best, as Baldy had mentioned in previous episodes. That's his favorite wrestling match ever. It was just legendary stuff. Like, as a kid, you had Warrior, or you had Hogan on one side, and Hogan, he defined our childhood and whatnot, but then Warrior on the other side, just so much energy and just kind of having them just kind of square off, champion versus champion. I thought it was just legendary. So for me, it was Hogan versus Warrior.
I'm surprised nobody touched on Warrior against Savage. I thought maybe somebody would have gone that route, but that was another one of his memorable ones. But
it was rushed for that time, anyways, and we weren't able to relish it as much as we did. Well, same goes for Papa Shango for that matters, but we didn't get to relish it as much as, say, even the Ultimate Challenge, but especially Rick Rude. Whereas that one, they actually drew it out really nicely. They had a few matches. They were stellar matches. And they even revisited that feud well after the feud was over.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
And, Baldy, so with that feud, the Macho Man versus Warrior, did they have a lot of great promos? Because there isn't one that really sticks out to me with in terms of their promos. Their matches, from what I can remember, is pretty bleak, but they were pretty good. But I don't remember much about their promos.
No, the promos, like I said, they could have done a much better job. Just like TJ said, it was pretty rushed. So it kind of started with Savage costing Warrior the title at Royal Rumble against Sergeant Slaughter, and then they had the match at WrestleMania, which ended up being a retirement match. And after that, Savage was gone. So it was only about a 2 or 3 month promo. So it felt very rushed. The match was very well done, but the promo was really rushed. So I think that's why that one. They're two of the biggest names, but that one doesn't really stand out just because it was very short compared to Warrior's other feuds.
The match was bound to be stellar because you got Savage, who's the consummate professional. This is a guy who used to literally break down every move that he used to do in the ring. And for a system like that and the structure like that, it would have catered to a lesser, more developed wrestler like the Warrior.
Yeah.
Who just ran in and did his own thing and was chaos. So he really helped the Warrior look good, which is also why Ravishing Rick Rude feud stands out, because he made the Warrior look good.
Yep.
So getting into the episode, TJ, as you kind of teed it up at the start, what if Warrior didn't get fired in the early 90s? But I think before we get into that, Baldy, if you want to just kind of give a quick recap of basically Warrior's introduction into WWF at the time in the late 80s, and just kind of the things that led up to basically his demise in the company.
So Warrior burst onto the scene in late 1987, and then went full mainstream at SummerSlam 1988 when he beat Honky Tonk Man in record time to win the Intercontinental title. At that time, Honky Tonk Man was the longest reigning Intercontinental champion ever. So they kind of put the rocket ship to Warrior, and it went blast off. So he had, after winning the title, he had the great feud with Ravishing Rick Rude, losing the title to him at WrestleMania 5, and then winning it back at SummerSlam 89, and then going on to beat Hogan at WrestleMania 6 for the title, and then ultimately losing the title to Sergeant Slaughter at Royal Rumble 91. And then his career kind of started to go downhill at SummerSlam 1991. So the main event was supposed to be Warrior and Hogan in a handicap match against Sergeant Slaughter, General Adnan, and the Iron Sheik. And the story, or as the legend has it, that right before the main event, Warrior threatened Vince with wanting $100,000. Otherwise, he wasn't going to go out in the main event. And so he went out, Vince paid him his check, and as soon as he came back, he was fired.
Was it 100,000 or 500,000?
I heard 100,000.
I thought it was $500,000.
I mean, even at that time, $100,000 in 1991 was a lot of money. So I had heard it was 100,000, but it could have been 5. But ultimately, Vince gave in to his demands because he didn't want to lose his main event. And as soon as he came backstage, he gave him his walking papers.
And then did he end up giving him the money?
He did.
Oh wow.
Yeah. So he gave him the money. He gave him the check right before going out, and then he came back. And as soon as he came backstage, he fired him. And only for him to return at WrestleMania 8, and then after WrestleMania 8, he had a decent run where, like TJ had mentioned, he came in, saved Hogan, had a decent run, and then ultimately, there was a build up for Survivor Series 92 where it was supposed to be Hogan and Warrior and Savage against Ric Flair and Razor Ramon, but just weeks before Survivor Series, Warrior and British Bulldog had ultimately failed the drug test and were both fired.
There's a lot of side notes even in that recount of history. I thought it was $500K, and then he also wanted the Hogan treatment, which was literally lesser work schedule, higher percentage of merchandise. But that's sort of like main event, because he thought he was a main eventer at the time, which he was. So he wanted that Hogan treatment.
Well, I mean, at that time, Hogan was still a full-time wrestler. Like, Hogan hadn't started doing movies at that time yet. So I don't think he had asked for the full Hogan treatment at that time. Like, maybe he did, but in terms of, the work schedule, Hogan was still working full-time at that time.
He was, but I think he was asking for it because he was the main event, supposedly, if you're the champion going into WrestleMania, even though it was Slaughter. I mean, it was him being pushed to the forefront, and then Hogan and Slaughter at the time, right, for the main event?
Yeah, well, I mean, they gave Warrior that year to see what he could do, and it's just basically what had happened was, even though Warrior was champion, when Hogan kind of returned to the house shows, it was people were still there to see Hogan. Like, Warrior may have been champion, but people were still there to see Hogan. That's ultimately what it came down to. So even though Warrior was champion for almost a year, they didn't really deem it a success because I think Hogan still overshadowed the title. Hogan didn't need the title, but Warrior being champion, everybody still wanted to see Hogan. So when Hogan came back, it was okay, well, we got to get the title off Warrior, and then we got to have Sergeant Slaughter be the middleman, and then the title's got to come back to Hogan at WrestleMania. So I think Warrior, he may have asked for those demands, but at that time they didn't deem him as, like, he was given his opportunity, but they felt like it was a blown opportunity because he didn't become what they thought he would become.
Unfortunately, I do have to agree with the statement that Hogan was the draw at that time, and he didn't need the title. And I think even the pay-per-view buys at that time indicated that anytime Hogan was back, especially when he came back for his feud with it Earthquake? Yep. When he came on back, I mean, that was a match people wanted to watch. Yep. Even though Warrior was on the card. So it was further proof that no matter who the champion was, Hogan was still the biggest drawing power in that company.
Well, that's why even for SummerSlam, to try and add more emphasis, they added the steel cage stipulation to the Warrior Rick Rude match. But at that time, it was still Hogan coming back in his matchup against the Earthquake.
Precisely, and that was the biggest draw. So even though you're the champion, if you're not even the main event status, and that's what people are coming to see, it's a little troubling to your argument. Yeah.
So, Baldy, was the salary between Hogan and Warrior like that much different? Like, I'm just trying to understand his whole reason to kind of like hold Vince McMahon hostage for 500, 100,000, whatever it was.
There was nobody that was on Hogan's level. Hogan was far and above everybody else, but at that time, I think Hogan was probably one of the few because at that time, they had their they had their salary, but a lot of the time it was pay-per-view bonuses because at that time, they were only doing 4 shows. So after each pay-per-view, you'd get the pay-per-view bonuses. So I think obviously Hogan was making that much more being in the main event as well as being the highest paid and the most noticeable. So I think Warrior just felt like, he'd come off his run with a title that he felt like he deserved to be paid more, but I think there were different ways that he could have gone to make his point across. Like obviously, holding out for a ransom right before the main event is not the most professional thing to do.
Okay, so then Baldy, what were the events leading up to him getting fired? So like I know that he had asked for money before, like a big pay-per-view, but were there any other events that were kind of leading up to his firings?
I'm sure there were other behavioral issues. Like
Yeah.
years later, anyone who worked in the WWF at that time it made it known that Warrior was a difficult superstar to work with from all grounds, like whether it be preparing for matches, doing promos, and just build-ups. Like Warrior was just extremely difficult to work with. So I'm sure that there were other things that led to it, but ultimately, him holding out for ransom SummerSlam '91 was the final straw. Like it showed how much Vince liked him as a draw. The fact that the amount of times, over the years he came back, and then ultimately, coming back in 2014 before he tragically passed away. Like Vince, I think, always had a soft spot for him. It's not even that; it's Warrior was always a draw. So it's he could have the behavioral issues, he could have all that, but ultimately it was one of those. It was a matter of time. Everyone knew it was a matter of time because there'd be times over the years where they would suggest Warrior because it showed like how many other wrestlers do you know that could have held Vince up for money and then 8 months later they're back at work again.
Right.
So.
Yeah. It's crazy to think though, like in this day and age, if someone were to try and do that, like they'd probably just be fired on the spot. But yeah, like you said, I think the fact that this guy was a draw, even though like Hogan, you could make the case was a bigger draw, but he, and by he I mean Warrior, was clearly bringing fans and eyeballs. But okay, so
Warrior was also the guy. I mean, we talked about the passing of the torch. That's what the Ultimate Challenge really was. When you had a babyface versus a babyface in a WrestleMania main event, which is usually good guy wins, everyone goes home happy.
Mhm.
So Warrior was being pushed to be Hogan or the next Hogan, and Hogan was being phased out because, again, everybody thought he was in the twilight of his career. So it's understandable why there was a little bit of favoritism for Warrior, but I do think, and it's been pretty well documented, that Vince and Warrior had a very close relationship.
Right.
And that allows for you to get away with a lot of things, and why Vince would have been a little bit more inclined to bring him back so often after the fact.
I mean, each time he came back, he was a draw. Like they put him in main event spots and prime spots, and every time he'd come back, like they'd give him a push, but just something else would go wrong, and that's ultimately that's the biggest what if. Like what if Warrior didn't end up derailing his own career? Like what would have happened in the early '90s? Would he have got another push? Like how far could he have gotten if he didn't get fired twice in such a short amount of time?
Well, it seems like you just finished watching another edition of The Self-Destruction of the Warrior.
I watched it once and I don't want to go back and relive it. Like I mean, it was wrong for them. It was tough to watch. Like being the Warrior fan, it was not the easiest thing to watch.
100%. And with all those main top talents coming in and basically
bashing him,
shredding
his reputation to pieces.
Yeah. But even then, even after all that, he still came back. So it really shows, with WWF, WWE, it's it doesn't matter how long time goes. Everyone is always welcome back at some point.
Yeah, for the most part. I mean, Bret Hart came back, Warrior came back repeatedly. But I mean, the way you set it up, it seemed like you were literally saying, and it is true. I mean, there's no other way to say it, that Warrior was his worst enemy sometimes when it comes to holding himself back, whether it be ego or whatever.
Okay, so with that being said, I think it's now time to kind of get into basically what Baldy was saying. Is let's just say Warrior never did get fired, never had his issues, and where do you? And I'll start with Baldy. Where do you think his career could have gone? What sort of matches do you think you could envision yourself seeing Warrior in the '90s having? Yeah.
I mean, a build-up I would have loved to see is what the plans were. Like, had Warrior not been fired after SummerSlam '91, the plans were for him and Jake the Snake to have a long feud.
Yeah.
And I love the feud that Jake the Snake had with Macho Man. With every kid remembers vividly of that snake biting into Randy Savage's arm. So I think they could have done wonders with that feud. And I think Jake was such a great in-ring technician that he could have carried Warrior similar to how Rick Rude carried him. So that's one feud that I would have loved to see with Warrior and Jake the Snake. That's the one that stands out for me.
And Jake was so good with his promos.
Yeah.
And they had built it up so nicely, the way they kind of wove in how Jake the Snake came in, helped him out with like those 3 challenges that he had to do to overtake Taker, and then being the guy who turned his back on the Warrior. Like, it was so well done and it was so well set up, but they did nothing with it.
No. That's what it was, right? Like that's what happened. Like that was supposed to be the build up leading into right after that, and then it just was derailed.
For sure, but I know this is gonna be hypocritical because I just said that this was my favorite feud. But even when he came back, like, why not try to pick up the pieces and go back to that what could have been with Jake the Snake? Instead, they put him in with Papa Shango.
Yeah.
And then he leaves again shortly afterwards. But I mean, they could have easily got right back into that.
They could have. And I think that would have been great to see. But I think at that time, Jake, in those couple of years, like he's kind of started dwindling towards a babyface run. Like he had
That's true.
Jake shifted between heel, babyface. So I think at that time, Jake kind of shifted towards babyface. So I think that's why that run may not have worked.
That is true, but I would have liked to see that. I think Jake the Snake was one of those characters that, like, he could have worked with anyone that was like a mid carder or like a top card, right? Like he was so versatile with how he was with his like promos and his in ring work, and seeing him up against with the Warrior would have been really interesting. But I'm gonna go with TJ on this question. Could you envision Warrior facing Bret Hart, or like those two having some sort of a feud? Because 90s, I mean, when Hogan left, Bret kind of took over as the face of WWF. So if Warrior were to have stayed on, like, they probably would have at some point met and kind of had some memorable matches, or if they would have even been memorable. But how do you think a square off or a matchup between those two would have worked out?
It would have worked out, but one of them would have had to go heel in that scenario. And it would have worked if Warrior turned heel, and rumor has it that he was supposed to, and then side with Flair and Perfect. And then go run that angle for a while. And then many people also believe that might have played a role in him getting fired in 92, days before Survivor Series. Is because of his refusal to turn heel. Who knows? I don't think it's a confirmed report. But he would have had to turn heel, I think, for Bret and him to have a lasting feud. Because Bret was a face going into it.
Yeah.
You're not going to have two faces squaring off again. I mean, this is not any sort of passing of the torch 2.0 a couple years after the Ultimate Challenge.
Yeah.
Could they have worked? 100%. I have no doubts in Bret's abilities. And like we've talked about before, Warrior was a guy who, as great as he was, needed to be carried in rings. And what better way to be carried than technical wrestlers who know their craft inside out? Rude, the most underrated wrestler, I think, for his time, and doesn't get enough credit for what he did and his in-ring abilities. You have Savage, which we all know about, and Hart's in that category of the upper echelon of technicians and those ones that really can like boost any talent you put in front of them. So they could have had a great feud, but it would have had to have, like, it would have been if Warrior turned heel at that point.
Yeah, that would have been interesting. I would have liked to see Flair and Warrior, just because with Flair at that time, his sell jobs, like, I think he could have made the Warrior look like $1 million, and I think Flair with his promos, Warrior with his legendary promos, I think that would have also been another great program. So I think, with that, you could have gone so many different ways. You could have gone Hart Warrior, you could have gone Flair. I mean, he never even had a big feud with The Undertaker. They had some matches in house shows. They had some other ones. Like, I think, him and Taker had a couple matches, but I think a long feud at that time with him and Undertaker could have really drawn some big money.
I mean, they did test it out for a little bit of time, but I do like the Flair idea worked because Flair was like the guy at that time. He was getting shafted. I know he did that. What was it that blading job that was? Didn't he get like reprimanded for that pretty badly when he bladed himself in that match? Was it at Mania? I think it was. But regardless,
yeah, it was.
You remember?
It was him, and I think it was him and Savage at WrestleMania 8.
Yeah, that was the one. Yeah, but he got like shafted as a result of that. Again, if you were to believe rumors, but him, like Flair was one of those guys. If he was a heel at the time, him feuding with Warrior, he had Perfect as his manager, I believe it was.
Yep.
And then, as you start setting up in this situation, Bret versus Warrior for next year, you have him join the dark side and then partner up with Flair, who would have carried him also in promos, which would have been so good.
Yeah. Like, it would have been completely different because, it was Flair, I think, because after Flair had, lost the title to Savage at WrestleMania 8, he wasn't even on the card at SummerSlam 92, which ended up being ultimately Savage defending the title against Warrior. Flair wasn't even on the card, and then, Flair won the title back, 2 months later at a house show, and then he lost it like a month later to Bret, and then early 93, Flair was gone back to WCW. So you wonder if, they had those long-standing feuds, if Flair would have considered staying in the WWF rather than going back to WCW.
But that's what I'm saying. Many people feel, if you were to believe the rumor mill, that Flair was being punished for that blading job and hence held off that SummerSlam card.
It's possible, but I mean, I get the build up to the big tag match at Survivor Series because, at that time it was, Mr. Perfect was going to be in the corner of either Flair or Savage Savage or Warrior leading up to that match. And, it turns out which one of them was going to be heel, which could have ultimately been great for long-term promotion if you wanted to turn one of them heel, but then it ultimately ended up, just being a fake sell job. And, the end of the match ended up being in a disqualification because neither one of them turned heel, and Flair and Perfect just came and attacked them both. So the ending was pretty bad to that match, but the angle leading up to it was intriguing, but they didn't really do much with it.
But again, they could have used Flair. This still doesn't explain why Flair wouldn't have been used for SummerSlam.
Yeah, no, it's interesting.
That's what I'm saying. I think he was being. I would like to believe the conspiracy theorists that he was being punished and therefore not utilized.
But then why give him the title a month later?
Because it's the WWE, man. They're like, hey, we're not going to put you on this card. You're not going to get the pay cut that you're going to get for being on one of our big 4 pay-per-views, but then we'll bring you on back.
And we'll give you a title run, but then only to lose it a month later.
Precisely. That's how they do things.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. AJ, what about you? Do you think there's a feud for you that stands out?
For me, I don't know. Like I would have really liked to have seen him versus Bret, because I think what TJ was saying, where Bret was such a great in-ring technician, that it would have been great to see him carry Warrior. And I feel like when you pair someone who's very technical versus someone who's not, you tend to get a lot of great matches, because I think they tend to complement one another a lot. So it would have been great to see him versus Bret. But one thing that I kind of wanted to ask you guys, I think one of the reasons why we love Warrior so much was because of just his whole appearance, like this like muscle bound guy with all these bright colors. He comes running into the ring. He has these wild promos, and maybe I'm just thinking out loud here, but do you guys think that one of the reasons why he worked so well from basically the late 80s to the very early 90s, so like we got like a very short run of him in the company, but do you think he worked so well because it was such a short run, that if he had a 10 or 15 year run, like we're talking, like if he went from 88 to basically the late 90s and had like a 13-year run, that his gimmick would have run old, like we would have just gone sick of it after 5-6 years?
I think so. I think one of the reasons why we hold it in such high regard is because, like we said, he'd disappear and then he'd come back, and then you get a taste of it again, and then he'd disappear again, and then he would come back, and then it's like, okay, it feels new again. Like I said, I think if he was a long-standing figure, like if he had a run like a Hogan or a Savage, I don't think he would have been able to withstand it, just because he wasn't able to adjust to his opponents. The opponents had to adjust to him.
That's what I mean, yeah.
And eventually, with only so many opponents and it feels like the same repetition over and over, you would have got tired of it. So I think because he left and then when he came back, it felt new again.
Yeah, and I wonder, like, so TJ, I'm gonna come to you with this one. Is like, do you feel like his gimmick was a little bit too gimmicky in the sense that, like, seeing a 10-year run of him, going to all these house shows, basically main eventing all the pay-per-views, that after a 5-6 year run, something that we've never seen from Warrior, but do you think after 5-6 years his whole act would have kind of run old?
Being a Warrior guy, I don't think it
Yeah.
would have been. And I know this is going to go against the grain from what you two were just saying, but I 100% agree that we enjoy him because we only got sample sizes every so often. You had a little bit of a taste, and before it wore out, he was gone.
Yeah.
Only to reemerge, and you get all that hype again, and he's gone again.
Yeah.
I would have loved to see what a Warrior gimmick would have been as a heel, and we didn't get to see that.
How would you kind of script that? Like, how do you think that would have unfolded?
The same way I just mentioned with the whole Flair Perfect thing. I think it would have worked well, and I think he would have blended into that role of a, again, darker Warrior. Because, I mean, it's easier to do that visual because you just talked about like the bright colors and all this other stuff. And now if you switch that up, and instead of this super energetic, bright guy running into the ring, and he changes his whole persona into this heel, this badass walking in, taking his time, and it's like a different person, all like it's a brand new character essentially.
So would you keep him in the same ring attire, but just do it all black and white or something like that?
Yeah, I mean that's doable. I don't see him like coming in and like, a luchador mask or anything else. But I mean, going into let's say if we went to black and white. Let's say if we used the Hollywood Hogan example, and he just rocked the black and white. His face paint suddenly became black and white. And he didn't have that energy when it came into the ring, and he just started playing up to the crowd when he would
like a slow walk,
whatever it may be. Even like when he would start like hulking up, so to speak, during the ring, and his finish would be like the press. But he'd tease the crowd with that, and then he'd change up and do something else.
Right.
He could have worked off of that. He still would have had to do those short matches.
Yeah.
But he could have just been like going back to like a Brock example. This beast of a figure, like this huge powerhouse. Yeah. Who just body slams people around and just beats them to next to nothing.
Yeah, I actually really like that. Yeah,
again,
I really like
that's
that.
it. And that's like his darker gimmick. And now you pair him up because we already know his promo work was all whack. It worked out well at that time. But if he started talking less and now you pair him up with a manager at the time, like the Heenan family was huge.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right? Or whoever you want to do. But if you pair him up with someone to be his talking piece, yeah, I think he could have had a little bit more longevity. We never would know. It's a big what if. We never really got that.
Yeah.
I think it would be hard. I would be surprised for anyone to put him in their Mount Rushmore of wrestlers because of his short bursts in wrestling. I think his gimmick was great for the time because when he emerged in the late 80s and the early 90s, he was known to be super edgy. He was a major detour from like this fun-loving, positive Hulk Hogan.
Yeah.
And the other guys coming in at this time. This was like super raw, super energetic. He was going counter to what your typical wrestler intro would be like. So he already was, and it worked. Like people gravitated towards that, especially the younger crowd, and that's why he was pushed so heavily. And that's why he became a fan favorite.
Yeah, like it was that music. When that music would hit, the crowd would erupt.
You'd be like, who the hell is this guy running full sprint into the ring?
Well, that's what it was. Like, I mean, like when you go back and watch that match with Honky Tonk Man at SummerSlam '88, like the crowd knew who it was. The crowd knew who it was, but the announcers were playing off like, who's it going to be? Who's it going to be? And then all of a sudden he shows up. The same thing happened in '92 when he showed up at WrestleMania 8. The crowd erupted again, and then forget we're like, could it be? And then there he is.
But again, it speaks to his character and the strength of that character. For who else would have been able to come in and defeat a guy who was holding the title for over a year?
Yeah.
A seasoned vet, and he quashed him in 30 seconds and no one spoke anything of it. Can you imagine if that happened in today's world? Social media would be lit up and they'd be like, I'm going to cancel WWE right now. Subscription over, forget these guys. They don't know what the hell they're doing.
Yep.
It just wouldn't have flied. But I mean, people bought in and it worked. So it was one of the things that it just worked out well for him.
Yeah, no, and I think what you said was definitely right. I think his heel turn would have worked. But like when you guys were kind of talking about like how you guys have booked him, the thing that I was really struggling is kind of, I guess the question that I had asked you guys is just like whether or not people would have gone sick, right? So like you just mentioned that the fact that he was able to come in and with all this energy beat a champion who had held the Intercontinental belt for so long, right? But as I think Baldy or TJ had mentioned, like the main draw was still Hulk Hogan. Like that whole like energy and that whole momentum that he had only went so far, right? And people, I mean, like I don't want to say that they got sick of him, but like he still couldn't really take the mantle from Hogan and just take this company to a whole other level. But I do agree with TJ in the sense when he says that, you know, like changing his character up and turning him heel and, you know, changing his colors, just his whole aura, I think would have really helped him in the 90s. But
You also got
yeah,
to remember that anytime Hogan's around, as much as I want to hate on him, his presence is heavy. So anytime he's around, no matter what his role is, people are bound to look his way because that's the guy they grew up with.
yeah,
The Warrior, I mean, even in his title run, he captured the title in WrestleMania, held the title for what was it, like 8 months? I think he lost it in January.
Yeah.
And while many people are like, "Yo, man, it was like a dark time. He kind of sucked." He still had some notable feuds. He feuded
Yeah.
he feuded with Rude. He feuded with Perfect. He feuded with DiBiase. So he had like some notable things. Granted, they weren't booking him well. There weren't any heavyweights that they were throwing him or any storylines that they were pushing well. I mean, he gets the short end of the stick because we want to say that he was a bad champion. And next thing you know, Hogan comes back. They're pushing the Slaughter guy who's anti-American. Who else is going to defeat the anti-American than the American hero?
Yeah.
Who else is going to come in and do it? So if Slaughter's your biggest heel going in, obviously people are going to be jacked about Hulk Hogan coming in and defending the United States.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the other thing I look at it is like, you know, at that time having, you know, such few pay-per-views, like they didn't really give Warrior a big chance to be a big draw. Like he wins the title in April of '90.
Precisely.
He faces his first big title match is at the same card where Hogan comes back. So like, I don't really think they put him on the track to success. And then after that, the next match is, you know, his next defense is not till January because the Survivor Series pay-per-view, it ends up having the whole Survivor Series teams, and that was the one year where they had like the ultimate final elimination match, where what they had is they had all the winners of survivors of each match face off in the finals again for like another bonus match. So the team ended up being the Ultimate Warrior, Hulk Hogan, and Tito Santana. So again, Warriors being overshadowed by Hulk Hogan and Tito Santana. And then a couple months later, he loses the title. So I think that while the idea was there, Warrior was never really given the full vote of confidence because he was always having to compete indirectly with Hogan.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, I mean, your talent is only going to go so well as you book them. And if you don't book them for success and you always bring in, like, I get why they would bring back Hogan. It kind of like, it's a weaker analogy, but it kind of reminds me of like the whole late night feud. You know, when Conan O'Brien takes over, but then they're like, yo, we're going to put Jay Leno right after you or before you. And so he's still kind of around. And then they're like, yo, Conan, you got to go because you didn't do too well. Because now we're going to give it back to Jay.
Cutting off his legs, before he could run,
Right? So we want you to be the guy. You're our late night guy. But no, it didn't work out. So now we're going to go back with Jay. Like, you can't have it both ways. If Warrior's going to be your guy, you push Warrior to the moon and back. You can't push him and then be like, hey, by the way, we got Hogan coming in, and then book him in the main event for his epic return, whether it be Earthquake, whether it be him facing off Slaughter, or whatever it is.
But I wonder if Vince always felt that Warrior could have been that main event guy, which is why he was given so many chances.
So then, So on one side you say that he was given chances, but then why do you think they just didn't fully invest in him?
Well, I think it was because it was like you said, Warrior was his own worst enemy. It's just when it feels like, you know, there's ideas and there's a chance, like he would do something, like, you know, SummerSlam holds him up for a ransom. And then there's talk of the possible heel turn, possible title run in late '92. Then he ends up getting fired for drug use. So I think as much as, you know, we like to say, you know, the cards were stacked against him, Warrior was also his own worst enemy.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I said it before. One of the rumors, again, was that he didn't want to turn heel at SummerSlam.
Possible.
And that goes back to, like, again, Warrior being Warrior, but he refused, apparently, if you believe the rumors, that he refused to turn heel. Like, he just changed his mind at the last minute. So they had this really weird botched ending.
Yeah, that's what
they ended up going for it. And then they're like, yo, screw this. Like, Vince ends up, he's like, you're not working. You're not being a team player. So they cut him again. Because he had just started up his antics again. And they already knew what was starting up. So they quashed it early rather than getting to the point where they're going to get short-sicked again. And then he's going to literally pull an ultimatum.
It very well could be. And I mean, that's why after that, instead of being an 8-month window, it ended up being 4 years before they brought him back into the fold again. So I think they really gave it time to see if his character would change. But again,
or if he had matured.
Yep, it was the same story again.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, it's really too bad that we never really got to see this whole character arc play out. Unfortunately, there were just too many issues going on with him and his character and all that. But do you guys have any closing thoughts that you guys want to add to the discussion?
No, I think we touched on all the possible rivalries, the possible heel turn, and just some of the angles that we could have seen. Like, who knows, what else could have been done. But I think we touched a lot on some of the biggest what ifs of what the Ultimate Warrior could have been to the WWF in the early 90s.
TJ?
No, just another reminder that Hogan always comes in and screws things up for everybody, and then when Hogan's around, it's always about Hogan. Just saying.
Baldy, any thoughts on that?
Yo, man, we're gonna do another hour-long episode here. Okay, let's just start.
All I'm gonna say is WrestleMania 8. Hogan wasn't even the champion yet. Him and Sid Justice still main evented. I rest my case. Hogan is bigger than the title. He is Mr. WrestleMania.
Mr. WrestleMania. What? You're gonna take that away from HBK all of a sudden?
Hogan was the first. Hogan was the original. He was main evented the first 8 WrestleManias.
Yeah, until he ruined himself and his legacy.
Actually, technically, he main evented 9 because he did walk out champion at WrestleMania 9 too.
Oh, that's great. In the 80s, means absolutely nothing for what he is now. But anyways, that takes us to the end of this episode and leaves us with a little bit more wiggle room for next week, which I think we'll leave open-ended again because it was fun just doing something random, I guess you could say. Or maybe we don't even do a what if episode next week. We can do a Hogan rant. I'm all down for that.
I'll have to skip out on next week's episode then.
Also, a special shout out to our latest follower on our brand new Instagram account, Desire Truffles, a product that Baldy here has subscribed to for about 4 months' time, is an avid user, and speaks volumes about. Any words on that, Baldy? He's a little too excited about this bit. But thank you for them and their support and for helping our friend Baldy.